Inside Outer Limits is a regular feature on the Paranormal UK radio network. Hello everybody once more, and welcome to another edition of the Inside Outer Limits radio show with myself, Chris Evers, the man from Outer Limits magazine, and of course my co-host, UFO royalty of course, the one and only Philip Mantle. Hello Phil.
Good evening, Chris. Nice
How
to
are you
speak
today?
to you, mate. Yeah, can't complain really.
That's good. So it's just nothing to complain about, or is it that you've got nothing to complain about?
Not really. I've got nothing to complain about. We're waiting for our first vaccination, which is coming up in a couple of days' time. So that'll be done and over and out of the way.
Yeah, I had mine about a week and a bit ago now, and absolutely fine. Slightly not a bruised arm, but not even sore. But you know, like if you're walking through a door frame and you accidentally bump the door frame when you're walking through with your shoulder. It was just a little bit like that, but other than that, absolutely nothing to worry about. So I took a week off work with that one, Phil.
Well, not last year, but the year before, I had trouble with my shoulders, believe it or not. Really painful shoulders, but I got some kind of problem with them, and I had to have cortisone injections. Yeah. And the injections themselves were nothing, but the day after. Yeah. Oh man, they really did hurt. So it can't be any. If I do get an effect, it can't be anything worse than that.
Yeah. I don't know. Right. Most people tend to think of like the modern UFO era beginning in about 1947. But we do know of some reports, don't we, Phil, going back earlier than that. And tell us about our guest today.
Well, yeah, I mean, there is a benchmark or a line drawn in the sand, if you like, with the modern UFO era. That was June the 24th, 1947, with Kenneth Arnold. It's when the term flying saucer came into popular culture. But, researchers have long since discussed, debated and argued that whatever UFOs may or may not be, they certainly predated Kenneth Arnold. Mm-hmm. And we'll have references to things that happened during the Second World War, for example, the term Foo Fighters. But we can go back. And, of course, what we're going to talk about today is an incident that took place in a place called Burton, Dassett in 1923. Now, last year I was contacted by our guest this evening, Richard Rokeby. Richard is a writer and researcher. He's got a keen interest in history, mysteries, I mean, you name it. He's previously served in the British Army and the UK Police. He's got an advanced certificate in education from Canterbury Christchurch University.
Oh, that wipes us out then, Phil.
Well, it does. I've got my cycling proficiency test from Blackgate's infant school, but that's about it. And he's married with 3 children, lives in Warwickshire. Now, Richard contacted me and we exchanged a few emails. He had his research on an incident, like I said, that took part in 1923. I'll let Richard go into that in a moment. And it was one of those instances where it was perhaps too short for a conventional book, but far too long for an article, a magazine article. So we decided to publish it as more as a short book or a booklet, but again, it's more than a booklet. And we'll leave Richard to go into the details. But good evening, Richard. Welcome.
Good evening, Philip. Good evening, Chris.
Good evening.
How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Can I just also say I've also got a BSc, so that's a bronze swimming certificate.
Is that how the conversation's going to go then?
and I think I got my one length, which is not a bronze. I think I got my one length certificate, but that were about it. But
very good.
There's a joke there, Phil, but I'm not going to go down that road.
No. Like I said, Richard, you live in Warwickshire. Tell us, for those that are not aware, tell us something about Richard Rokeby, who you are, what's your background, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, how did you get involved in the subject?
Yeah, well, I suppose I was always interested in it from a very young age. Child of the 70s, so had an interest in, I suppose, what started would be off as science fiction. I read a lot of science fiction books, and then the Star Wars films were coming out. But I think the real thing that caught my imagination was Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So I'd have been about 8 or 9 when that came out, and I was allowed to watch it, probably on the back of the Star Wars films. Obviously, it was a bit adult for me then, but it sort of always stuck with me, and it just seemed to bring all the fantasy and adventure of Star Wars, but it was happening on Earth. And I think as time goes on, we're beginning to realise just how close to the truth Close Encounters of the Third Kind was, particularly the late 70s era in the United States, where there was a lot of sightings and abductions and contacts. So I think that was the initial of it, and I picked up a few books, and it sort of stayed with me. And then I went off and had a bit of a career in the military, and as mentioned there, in the police, and became a detective, and sort of always enjoyed investigations. I was still keeping up with my research on things that interested me, and as I've said before about the Lights Upon the Hills, this sort of story found me when I moved to Warwickshire in 2002. My wife's from Warwickshire. We moved out of London, and I started reading a little bit about the area, and it is a really old and interesting place. But I found a story in a ghost book, a book called The Ghosts of Warwickshire by Betty Smith, who was quite a renowned local historian. And there was one chapter within that, which was called the Lights from Burton, Dassett. And I read it, and I read the account, and it just cried out to be investigated further, but not necessarily.
Yeah. So
sorry.
Where is for those that are geographically challenged, like myself, Burton, Dassett, whereabouts is it? What location are we talking about, Richard?
Okay, so Warwickshire is in the heart of England. Describes itself as the heart of England, and the most probably famous town is Stratford-upon-Avon. With obviously William Shakespeare coming from there.
Yeah, I'd like to interrupt there, because if it wasn't for Stratford-on-Avon, I wouldn't be here.
Oh right, do tell.
Yeah, well, my late mum was originally from Northern Ireland, but she moved to Birmingham after the war, and my father was from Wales, and he did the same, and they both met in Birmingham and got married and had their honeymoon in Stratford-on-Avon.
Well, I think there's a plaque there, actually, now you come to mention it.
Yeah. And of course,
a blue plaque.
Yeah, years later.
There's a set of stocks waiting for you, Phil.
Yeah. Some years later, they moved to Yorkshire because my mum's family had settled here, and I was born here. But they met and married in the West, in the Midlands, and Stratford-on-Avon. I knew they had the honeymoon in Stratford. And it was only when my mum died and I dug out all the old paperwork and I found her original marriage certificate and saw that they were married there as well. So so sorry to interrupt, Richard.
No, that's fine. It is a lovely town. It is rich in history. It's a nice town just to walk around in obviously normal times, but it's very picturesque. And if you get that on a summer's day and the pubs are full, and I did go to a bit of a, where during the last lockdown break, some friends and I went just to camp outside, and we had a really just outside Stratford, but went into Stratford when you could get a drink with your mates. And it is a wonderful town just to hang around. But sort of Stratford is out to the west of Warwickshire, and it's probably around maybe 10, 15 miles west of Burton Dassett Hills. So I think what's unique about Burton Dassett Hills is it's quite a prominent area for what is generally rolling countryside, and sort of from Warwickshire, the land tends to get flat all the way out to the Wash at Norfolk, and then going east and then going west, it then starts to build up through the Mendip Hills and the Brecon Beacons and the Black Mountains. So it starts to get higher. So it's generally rolling countryside, and then you get these sort of 5 hills of Burton Dassett, which, from the top of there, you do get quite a clear view all around you. And there's something in that to me that says that's why it maybe attracted sort of the activities it did, sort of 1922, 1923. But it's a relatively small area. It's a country park now, but they pack a lot in. So I do describe it in the book. It's always popular. It's quite a popular area, but it's really interesting, as well, because you cut through it on the way to other places. So if people want to just imagine rolling countryside and then suddenly these rather large hills and then rolling countryside again.
That's a bit like all that, Richard. You go past it to go to other places.
Yes, yeah.
No, you're starting Hull to get anywhere.
Yeah. Well, I'm originally from the northeast, and where I'm originally from, they used to say that nobody would go there purposefully. You'd pass it on the way through. Which is,
well, folks, we'd like to thank you for the interview this evening. Does the area then, Richard, does it have a long history of ghost sightings or UFO reports?
Well, obviously the events I detail go back to 1922. So there's a number of ghost sightings before that. So Edge Hill. So your listeners, I'm sure, will have heard of the English Civil War and the Battle of Edge Hill, which was one of the first big battles in the Civil War.
Phil remembers that.
Yeah, my mother-in-law was part of it.
So there was that happened. Edge Hill is around about 2-3 miles east of Burton Dassett. It's not quite as high as Burton Dassett, but it's certainly sort of leading up to it. So in 1642, the Battle of Edge Hill occurred there, and it was quite strange. Going off tangent a bit, but it was quite strange that the two armies, the Roundheads and the Cavaliers, the Parliamentarians and the Royalists, they didn't go out looking for other. One was heading north, one was heading south. They decided to take the western track, if you like, and the scouts ended up bumping into each other, and Oliver Cromwell decided, well, this would be a good place to sort of test their mettle, and a battle went ahead. Quite a few thousand people, soldiers, died, and it didn't really resolve anything. The war rumbled on for another 4 or 5 years yet. But what was said is that was happened in the October, and the Christmas Eve of 1642, there was reports from the locals that they once again heard the fighting and guns, sounds and shouts of men dying, and the clash of steel on steel, and horses neighing and running around and screaming, coming from the hill, and it was quite widely reported at the time. And if you think that was the sort of first real battle on the English mainland since about probably the Battle of Baden Hill 600 or 700 years earlier, then you can imagine the emotions that went with it, and it's maybe one of those events that were just captured in the atmosphere because of its horror in some ways. And it has been reported again since. Occasionally you get reports of the people can hear the noise of battle coming from Edge Hill. So I think that's sort of the main one in the area. But it goes, as I said, the activity started in sort of December 1922. Originally was reported as ghosts being seen on the hill, and they were described. Have always been described the same way as these sort of bluish, whitish, sometimes red lights. There was one very early account where that somebody thought they saw a figure in the lights. but that wasn't corroborated anywhere else. But again, with the ghosts story, you can completely understand why people did attribute it to ghosts, because it was relatively close to the end of the First World War, and it was a bit of an activity. If reports of ghosts were seen throughout the country, then people would go to that area to see if they could see the ghosts. And somewhere in there, there is something about those people that had lost sons and daughters because of the war. Wanted some sort of confirmation that ghosts exists, in the hope that they would see their sons again. So it did start off as a ghost story in that area, and then sort of stayed that way until I felt it was time for a bit of reinterpretation, really. Was
this an era when spiritualism was on the rise in interest? Is that the kind of era we're talking about?
Yeah, you're kind of phrase, you're dead right, Phil. Yeah,
and I think it's also interesting when you look at what we would describe as, in inverted commas, conventional ghost sightings, i.e. apparitions in and around properties. If you boil a lot of those down to what the witness actually saw, it tends to be lights that eventually, as it works its way through our brains, comes out the other end as being a figure or a monk or a child or whatever, or a Roman soldier. But initially, they saw lights. For example, there's a place in the Peak District National Park, and this lights have been seen going across the hills, and the folklore of the region will tell you that these are the lanterns of the ghostly Roman soldiers, because there was a Roman road in that area. But the Peak Park Rangers, of course, have been called out a time or two because they thought people were actually lost on the hills. There are no ghostly Roman soldiers. All that has been seen is lights, strange lights. And of course, they are interpreted in different ways. So what made you get your teeth into these events, Richard, and think, right, fascinating, but I'm going to have a look at this. I'm going to gather all the data and see what I can make of it. What stirred you?
Well, I think it was the account and the fact that nobody had looked at it through the lens of a UFO or and I use the term in the book, this new term that's come along, this UAP, unexplained aerial phenomena. I don't think anyone had looked at it that way previously, and for me it was just I just felt that it should be interpreted that way if there was evidence to suggest that that's what it was. And I when I had a look further into the area, I found, and the accounts tended to suggest that these objects were under some sort of intelligent control. Again, ghosts tend to be fairly random and fairly set in their routine, if you like. If they're seen one way, they're generally seen by other people in the same sort of format. Whereas the lights from Burton Dassett were seen in different contexts and doing different movements. And I just felt, the more I looked into the area, there was those other anomalies, which no doubt we'll touch on, such as the church and the layout of the hills, and later the military base, that just suggested that there was a bigger story there. But just to go back a point on the spiritualism side, it was that was the prevailing sort of thought pattern around people lights in the 1920s. But the spiritualism comes back from can go back to in sort of the UK from after the Civil War, which I found really interesting when I looked into that, and how the losses of the American Civil War prompted spiritualism that was then brought over to the United Kingdom sort of shortly after, but then was reinvigorated just after the First World War. There's a lot of famous people that, of course, were involved in it around that time. So so I think that it was it was at the height. These lights were at the height of the new spiritualist era of the early 20s, and that's what caught the imagination, and that's what found its way into the papers. But yes, I just felt, Philip, that the story needed to be told. I just felt that this story needed to be put out there for people to have a look at and to make their own decisions. And as you discussed earlier on, I was really pleased when you suggested it as a book. I mean, you're right to point out it's a concise account, but I was keen just to remain with the story and not to get too embroiled in other areas.
Tell us a bit more about the events in 1922 and 23 then, Richard. What was happening?
Sorry, Richard. Before you do,
of course, Chris.
I'm particularly interested in the railway signalman's experience at Nightcote. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that as well, please?
Yes, yeah, of course. So, he's one of my favourites as well. Maybe because the police got involved with that one, I don't know. But so from December 1922, stories started to circulate around the area of Burton Dassett. So Burton Dassett was a village up until about the Middle Ages, and then the combination of the Black Death and some rather mean landlords resulted in people sort of abandoning it to some of the lower land and the bigger towns. But it was still a place people sort of went to. Some people would still live and work there because of the vicarage on the area. It's always had quite a rich history in iron ore mining that was utilised during the First World War. Obviously, that began to sort of peter out a bit by 1922, but there was still a steady footfall of people going up and down into the hills, and reports start to circulate within the locals of these lights that have been seen on the hills, and have been seen moving around, described as blue and white lights. Flitting hither and thither in the language at the time, and it started to build up momentum. I mean, I think in the book I detail around eight accounts, but there was probably 100 accounts of people talking about it, and so much so that the Banbury Gazette became interested in the story, and they ran 2 articles in 1923, in early February and late February of 1923, discussing what it could be. But the initial reports came that people had saw the lights, as I said, and they were seeing them at all sort of times of day and night. That the first sort of chap to put his name to an account, and my accounts are split between the ones I could find from the newspapers and the ones I can find from Betty Smith's book. But there was a gentleman by the name of George White, and he told the newspaper that he'd heard about the lights, and he took 2 of his friends up onto the hills, probably a bit sceptical, to see if he could see these lights, and he took a pair of field glasses. So this was sort of early 1923, and he was surprised, and so were his friends, to see the lights. And he said he saw them go over. But what he actually says in the report, he says, is he felt the lights go over him. And I think that word "felt" is really key. So to me, that suggests a change in the atmospherics around him, some sort of downward pressure, perhaps some static electricity. Something that's messing with the gravitational field. So that word I sort of really sort of singled out and just discussed in the book. Well, what could that mean? I mean, he definitely used that rather than say I saw them. He said I felt them go over me, and I just felt, well, if you think about it, at the time in 1923, aircraft was still relatively in its infancy, in as much as they were big, loud, noisy things that you would know if it flew over you that it was a plane rather than a strange light. There was no drones, the lights themselves moved in ways that we describe that as difficult to do under sort of man-made or manned control. So I thought that word was really interesting, and he reported to the paper that he felt that the lights made him a bit uncomfortable, but that's very much unusual. Most people, and I do think this is a positive UFO story. I don't think these lights meant there's any harm. I think they were probably searching for something. Their movement would suggest they were searching for something. Some of their actions would suggest they're searching for something. But people who saw them felt very positive about them. It wasn't something generally that people were afraid of. But he did say it made them, it made him a bit uncomfortable, not seeing anything like it before. And they were white and blue, and they were changing colours. So he was the first one to put his name to it, and then other accounts came in. There was a horse groom that saw one of the lights down near a pond, and said that the horse was a bit startled by it. So my time in the military, I spent a bit of time working with horses, and I know, generally natural noises and objects, they're not really spooked by, but they are, until you get them used to it, they are spooked by mechanical objects, buses and cars and things, bells, etc. So this to me said again that this object was, if not mechanical, wasn't organic. It was something that had been produced. But I think what that story did is it then lent itself to the reason, the reasons people were giving for what it was, and I'll probably come back to that later. But from that account of a bluish whitish light above a pond, we got the idea that it could be swamp gas or will-o'-the-wisps, you two will far more experienced as I am in this than I am, and you will know that swamp gas is often used as a sort of get-out clause for UFOs and UAPs, but I think it did provide somebody with a get-out clause, and a number. The paper itself, the Banbury Gazette, said to people, well, it's probably just a swamp gas. But in the book, I cover the reasons why I don't think it's swamp gas. Not least that it's February in Warwickshire, and Warwickshire is not a tropical country. It's not a hot country at the best of times. It does get quite hot during the summer, but certainly in February 1923, it's unlikely that the environment would be conducive to swamp gas or marsh gas. But that was assigned to it, and that sort of seemed to just, some people seem to accept that. And then the other story that Chris mentioned there, I think is a good one. So and again it's detailed in the book, but as I mentioned earlier on, the iron ore mining was going on within the hills through the First World War. Consequently, there is a lot of railway tracks in that area, including passenger trains. And Night Court was a signal station. So, if your listeners can picture this, a signal box, it's high up in the air, and it's designed to be an observable platform, if you like, to give you 360 views and to make sure that the rail line is clear and there's no obstructions in the track, so the signalman can change the signals and direct the train, and that is a responsible position, probably even more so back in 1923 than it is now, without any sort of computer help. Somebody really had to know what they were doing. Their livelihood was really important to them and their families. But a real woman made a report that he saw an orange coloured orb, is how we describe it, float down from the hills and then stop in front of his signal box and just wait there off the ground, and then float off again back to the hills. And he was so perturbed, I suppose, by this incident, that he rang the local police and said, "This has just happened to me. I've just seen an orange orb floating above my signal box." It could be that he was concerned about the train, but and he thought, well, I best report this in case something happens, and that is quite a motivation, and you understand that around his duty, but also he must have thought, well, are people going to believe me? But he felt so committed by it, and you've got to believe his account. I think he's a credible witness, that he rang it into the police, and the police dispatched a police car to him. And I've been in those situations myself, and you can imagine, if you're double crewed and you've got one officer that's sort of licking his pencil, taking the details, and the other one sort of looking around, saying, well, what has he seen? Scratching his head, looking around. So I think it is a really good image, but importantly, I think it's a really good account from a credible witness who's in a platform that's designed to see things. So he couldn't have got confused with anything else, and who's a trained observer. That's his job, is to see.
Exactly. He's in a position of authority, isn't he? Really, it's a heck of a lot of responsibility, making sure the trains get through correctly and on time and everything else, and people's lives are in his hands. So he's obviously a witness that has a lot of credibility behind him. Absolutely. So just moving on slightly then, Richard, how does the local church become involved in this?
Yeah, so I think what's probably unique about my book is I've just managed to pull a few what were disparate sort of anomalies with the area together to show a picture or to tell a story. So the church is All Saints Church. It's been there since Saxon times and was a fairly small sort of Saxon church. It was came in 1086 for the Domesday Book. It was mentioned then, and it was a little bit bigger, and it had been extended out, so it matched a lot of fairly common Norman churches of that period. But then it did seem to, somewhere between that Norman period and the 14th century, it did seem to receive a real boost, and it got a lot of money, and it got really big particularly for the areas, as I said earlier on. It's up a load of hills, and sometimes churches were put on top of hills, and that was part of the experience of going up to the hill, particularly in Wales in particular. But this wasn't traditional to have a church up on the hills in Warwickshire around that time. Generally, they were lower lying, and with easy distance to the local towns and villages. But this church is up one of the hills, although it is in a dip within the hills. But it's now referred to as the cathedral in the Cotswolds because of its size. So it did get a real monetary boost at some point, and it was extended out, and it was made quite big. And I describe it, as you go through into the church of All Saints Church, as being sparse but expansive. So you really get the sense of the scale when you walk through the door. And it's interesting from as soon as you walk in to the church. So above you have the wooden outside door you'd normally get in the church, and then you'd have an archway with an inner door, which then leads into the church, which is on the northern side of the church. And as the church is, the altar is at the east end, and it sort of runs north to south. But if you walk through the north side, on the arches above the door, there is depicted lots of orbs. Now, whether that's coincidence or not, I don't know. But when you look at other churches, you tend to get an inscription, or you'll tend to get patterning. But this church in particular has orbs, just round circles, half circles, I suppose, going up above the doorway. And as soon as you think that, you think, well, this is going to be something unusual. Then you walk into the northern side of the church. Now, traditionally, the north side of the church was termed the evil side, or was referred to as the evil side of the church, which is why you tended to get gargoyles and these sort of fantastic carvings on that northern side of a church. Well, in the All Saints Church, there is a series of columns that supports the church, and around the column, quite unusual. It's not unique, but quite unusually, there is a series of carvings, and these carvings depict really strange images. So one of them is what's termed the Green Man. So no doubt your listeners will have heard of the Green Man, and that's in itself, that's not unusual to be in a church. A number of churches would include the Green Man, and the Green Man is also known as a sort of pagan spirit as well. But it's also considered the joining of two worlds. So it's often depicted to show the joining of the pagan religion with the Christianity. So that's why it's often depicted. But if you wanted to take it further, is it showing more than that? Is it showing the joining of two worlds? In fact, two completely different worlds meeting, and that's why it was depicted there. And I say that because some of the other carvings are unusual as well. So there's a half man, half animal creature that is depicted, and there's a number of what would be traditionally termed hunting animals. Dassett does mean sort of a hunting ground, but these animals are upside down, so they're as if they've been they have been carved into the rock of the stone rather, from as if they're upside down or from the sky, or have they been levitating up? So now I've got to say I'm no expert in medieval carvings. I've just researched a bit, but it does seem when with all these sort of points that I discuss in the book, if they weren't all in a what is effectively a 3 or 4 square mile park, if they're all disparate around the country, you think, well, that's just coincidence. But the fact is they're all crammed into a fairly small area. So I think the carvings are really unusual. And then the thing for me is the painting. So if you go past the columns of that northern side, the column arches, and then you're in the middle of the church, and if you look east towards the altar, then there is 2 enormous paintings. One is of the Virgin Mary on the left-hand side, and the one on the right is of Saint Michael, and they're bigger than life size, and they're beautiful artifacts in themselves, or beautiful displays in themselves, and that would be interesting enough from that sort of religious perspective. But on the north side of the wall, there's a number of illustrations there. One of which is described as an angel, which is detailed in the book, but it looks a really strange creature for an angel. It's probably closer to a gargoyle with quite a broad nose and sort of long hair. But then there's a depiction of two kings, and the first king is likely to be Saint Ethelbert, who was king of Mercia. He was originally born from East Anglia and married into the Mercian kingdom, fell out of favour, and was beheaded in 794. And we sort of know it's him because he's holding his own head. So it's a kingly body with a kingly head with a crown on top of it. But the a bit like the traditional ghost of the headless people, he's actually holding his own head, and it is a fantastic piece of artwork in itself. They all date from the 14th century. The carvings and the paintings all date from around about the same time. And they're fairly sure that is St. Ethelbert. He's actually buried in Hereford Cathedral, which is around about 30-40 miles west, and they're fairly happy with that one. But the second figure is the one I think was telling me something else. It was telling another story. And that could be numerous things. It could be St. Oswald, who was king of Northumbria and died in battle not too far away, the Battle of Macefield in Oswestry in 642. And St. Oswald is often depicted holding a scepter and an orb. And this figure has in his hand, up in the air, and he has an orb, I'll say at the moment, on top of his hand. And what the other sort of theory behind that is that it's a wise man or a magi from the Christmas story, because of this orb that's been sort of proffered in his hand. But what I found out is when you look at that at the orb, something really amazing stands out, and that is the orb isn't in his hand. The orb is floating above his hand by 2 or 3 inches, and what's happened is either through malice or through natural erosion, the paint between them has been scraped off. So, and it is very obvious when you look at the pictures which are in the book. It does show that you can draw the line from the hand and draw the line from the orb, and you can see that the orb is floating above the hand. So, as I said earlier on, I'm no expert in medieval art or carvings, but I did do a bit of research, and I can't find anywhere else where a wise man or a magi is depicted with an orb floating above his hand. It's often shown as if he's holding it flat on the hand, or like he's holding people would hold a water bottle.
So do you think then, Richard, that because of that image, that drawing, that artwork, that these kind of sightings have been going on in that area for perhaps millennia?
Yeah, I do genuinely believe, Chris, that this is telling us something. I mean, the shape of the orb is very much like a bottle, but it's also, if you wanted to bring it into the UFO world, it's very much like the spinning top type UFO craft that are often described. The pattern on it has an undulating pattern, which could suggest movement, a circular movement, and I do think it is telling us a story. So, particularly where it is, like I said, you've got to look at it holistically with the area in general. It's on that northern side. It's depicting something floating in the air, and it's either a local king or dignitary that is trying to get a bit of vicarious glory from it by saying, look, I controlled these objects that we're seeing floating around, or that they're just catching it for posterity, and it's something that's happened around the time they were painted, so the 14th century, or it's happened, the Saint Ethelbert figure might be a way of putting it into context. So that was 794. Maybe it's happened around that time. But I just do think it's so unusual that it should be depicted that way, and I think it is telling us something about that area.
Did you actually look into what the ground is like in that area? I know you mentioned the iron ore is being mined. Is there anything else around there that perhaps could produce earth lights or anything like that?
No. So that one of the options we had, which I know Phil has done a lot of research to, is the theory of like earth lights, so the Hasselden lights, as I pronounced it.
It's Hessdalen.
Hessdalen, thank you. Hessdalen lights, and the latest sort of theories I've read about that was the thought that it could be something to do with the geology of the place. So Burton Dassett is generally based, it's iron sort of hard rock within the area. There's nothing other than the height, really. There is nothing sort of too unusual about what builds up the land. Perhaps only we have these sort of 3 hills in a row with 2 drop back and quite a dip in the middle of it. So yeah, I think the iron ore connection might have something to do with it, but where it fits in, Chris, I'm not quite sure.
Okay.
There's another interesting establishment in the area as well that brings it right up to date, is there not, Richard? And we're talking about MOD Kinnerton.
Yes. So it's pronounced Kyneton, MOD Kyneton.
I was close for a Yorkshireman. I was close.
No cigar, Phil.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, so it is really interesting. So if you were to stand on Windmill Hill, which is one of the bigger hills at Burton Dassett hills, and you look west, then you can, the military base is literally a stone's throw away. You can see right into it, and it's a huge expanse of a military base. It appeared well after the events. It appeared around about 1941. It was built in 1941 for the war, and it was used as a ammunition dump and then a transit camp. But it sort of got bigger as I drove past it again prior to lockdown. They were expanding it again. So it is very central. So there is some thought as to why it's there. Why it's particularly there is maybe up for debate, but why it's in that general area, because it holds 60% of all the British military's ammunition. The train line just for the base itself is 76 miles worth of track. Wow. And it has these high density explosive storage houses, which are quite unique, really. There's not many military bases that we have in the UK that hold these type of houses, and as I made clear in the book, I don't know, and I don't want to know, because I don't want people knocking on my door. But it would be a reasonable assumption to make that at some point battlefield tactical nuclear weapons are moved through MOD Kyneton.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to mention there, when on the running to finishing this book, Richard, I wrote to both MOD Kyneton and the Ministry of Defence direct and asked them that very question. Were tactical nuclear weapons ever stored in the past or currently at the base, and got no reply whatsoever from either of them. I mean, nothing.
Oh, right, okay. And that was quite a while ago, wasn't it, Phil, that we sent that letter off? Yeah. So, I mean, there is a term that you use in covert policing, which is neither confirm nor deny, whatever the question was. So it's probably something along the lines of that, remaining silent. But and to be honest, I don't want to poke too much into that. But it would be a reasonable assumption to make, and we military weapons are moved by train. So but what I think is interesting about that is, if you had and I have said this before, I know, but if you have a checklist of what you want within a UFO story, strange lights, check, depictions in a church, check, military base, check, and then a sub level under that would be nuclear military base, because of the connections that has with UFO sightings. And with Burton Dassett, you get a check as well, you get a tick next to that, and that's why I think it's interesting. And someone did another talk shop, I was asked the question, well, do you think the military base was placed there to observe the lights? And it was less than 20 years after. There might be something in that, but I have no proof or evidence or accounts to say that there were. But it just goes back to this sort of fascinating area that everything is in one place, including a military base.
Have you seen anything yourself in the area, Richard? Have you witnessed any of these happenings?
I haven't seen any lights, unfortunately, and I have been going there fairly relatively regularly up until the lockdown and the pandemic struck, of course. And I hope to get there, over the next few years. I think that that 100 years on, 2023 February, would be really interesting to see if something comes back. But I did have one experience, which I detail in the book Lights Upon the Hills, which is around a friend of mine who's interested in this sort of stuff as well. We went out and we used to do sort of observations late at night, and again we went in February. It was just between quite a large storm we had in February of last year, and just before the pandemic struck, actually. and we got a 24-hour window where we could see before the next wave or next storm front came in. We had a bit of time to go up on the hill, so we did climb up in the hills and used our red lights and got our backpacks with some flask and a ground sheet. You can't stay over in Burton Dassett Hills, but you can go in quite late into the night. So we used to go up and we'd set up a couple of observation posts effectively to see what we can see. And it says it is a country park, so you do get people driving up into it fairly late at night. But from about 11 o'clock, it all goes quiet, and we were there, and it was pretty cold, but I was pretty snug in what I had on, and I could look out over towards Warwick and the train line, and there's a little wood there called Fox Covert Wood, and I could look over that. But whatever it was, I was just tired. I fell asleep, but then was woken up by a noise. Now, not too far away is the M40, and you can hear the traffic from the M40 generally. But when I woke up, this was about 3 a.m. I heard a noise, and it wasn't. I know it wasn't the traffic. The traffic was too low by then, but it was another noise, and it was like a rotating engine, industrial noise, and it was getting louder, and it was revving faster and faster and faster, and it seemed to be everywhere, all around me, all at once. And I was underneath a tarpaulin, looking out, and I didn't feel any change in the atmospherics particularly. I didn't see any lights above me. I didn't see anything like that. But just this noise was permeating around, and it was revving and revving and revving, and it had this rotary sort of sound. And it lasted for 5 minutes, and then suddenly it stopped, just dead quiet again. And then you could pick up the normal sort of noises of the evening and the occasional car down the M40. I just thought that was really strange. I went to my friend. He'd fallen asleep as well, and I said, "Did you hear that? Did you hear that?" And he said, "No, mate, sorry, I didn't hear anything. I was fast asleep." I was like, "Oh dear, never mind."
Well, I'm glad to hear that you didn't go up there on your own, Richard.
Yes, I know, yeah. And then we sort of moved out of the area, went down, but it stayed with me, and I'd check my watch, like a good UFO investigator, make sure there was no sort of missing time or anything there, and it hasn't. It sort of started at 3:47 and finished at 3:52 or so. But then, again, through my research later on, I came across an account which happened in South Africa in, I think it was around about 1997. And it was a South African farmer describing what he saw, what was described as a mothercraft. It was 1994, Warrington in South Africa. He described what he saw was a mothercraft and a number of lights that were following it. And he described the engine as being like the sound he heard of the mothercraft as being like a VW Beetle. And as soon as I read that, I thought that was it. So if you've heard of VW Beetle, it has a distinctive engine sound.
Yeah.
Because the way the engine.
Yeah. That my very first car, Richard, was a Volkswagen Beetle.
Oh yes, yeah. I mean,
yes.
They're a classic car, and the engine's at the back, aren't they? But they're offset, so they have this rotary noise to them. So the old VW Beetles, and that's exactly what it was, and I knew that's what I heard, and I was like, great, there is some precedence for this, in as much as somebody's heard something similar. But what it was, I don't know. Was it perhaps on one end of the scale, was it some farm machinery that was going on in the early hours to was it a UFO that was in the area? I don't know. Was it something from the military base? Again, someone pointed out for me from another talk show I did that actually the sound could be projected from some distance away, and actually I was in the funnel of it, if you like, which again, because I didn't have any other sort of atmospheric traces or any other effects other than the sound, that's probably a good shout as well. But I just think it is, it's a fascinating area of the country, and I'm sure there's more to be discovered about it.
With the sightings in the 1920s, was any noises or sounds reported with any of those at all, Richard?
No, that's a really good point, Phil. No, there was nothing in the accounts I've heard. Accounts I've heard that was anything unusual in sound. Like I said, this George White felt the atmosphere change as it went over them, but nothing again sound. But again, what I thought was interesting with the South African account was there was a mothership associated with these bright lights that were travelling behind it. So, could there have been something else around there?
It's interesting you say that about the Volkswagen Beetle. Like I said, it was my first car, and I'd got married at that point. And sometimes when I went to visit my mother, she had an old dog we'd had for many, many years. And the dog would go to the door. And my mother would say,
right, yes.
"Oh, it's Philip on his way." The dog, I reckon, could hear the noise of the engine of the car before my mother could. And, it was a family pet. I'd grown up with the animal, and the dog was always there waiting for me.
Yeah, well, it is a very distinctive sound, and it was part of the charm of those vehicles, wasn't it? It was the sounds of the engine.
It was. Yeah. I mean, my ex-wife made me get rid of the car and get something bigger. In hindsight, I should have got rid of her, but never mind. She'll not be listening.
Yeah, maybe that was the start, eh?
Yeah, but so we've gone from, medieval carvings and paintings in a church to sightings in the 1920s and right up to the military base. When you compile all that together, Richard, and your thoughts and your experience of this strange noise, how did you work it out what you think might be the nature and origin of these lights? How did you come to a conclusion?
Well, I think you've got to follow the evidence, and I use that word. I appreciate a lot of what I've got is accounts from sort of back from the papers, but some people like the railwaymen. There's absolutely no reason I can see to doubt the credibility. Some people are named, and you've got to look at all the holistic. You look at it holistically about how all these things fit in together. If it was just one of a number of anomalies, it's very difficult. But by the time you list all of them together, including my own experience, it does to me say that something, absolutely fantastical is happening and has happened in that Burton Dassett area, and may happen again. And I think the story is really interesting. I really enjoyed writing it and researching it. I think it's we give a good account of what's happened, and people can make their own mind. I'm beginning to think as though the objects themselves are perhaps some form of drone. We're increasingly looking at if there is going to be contact from alien civilizations. It would be in a form of a drone initially, perhaps, and that's perhaps what we would be doing. So maybe that's reflected back, and they do seem to be searching for something. So it's at one point the lights are described as lighting up a whole building. Then that takes some doing. But if you look at see how they're moving around, it could be that they're searching for something perhaps going back to Chris's point about the iron, something that they felt was there. I mean, I do discuss in the book the idea that the three hills, so when we went up in February, the three prominent hills of Burton Dassett seem to match in pattern to the belt of Orion. They're in the same sort of angle, and you have those sort of two large hills or stars and a smaller one off to the side. And yes, it's a bit speculative, but if you were to see Orion above these hills on February, which is when the sightings occurred, you can't help but notice there's a symmetry there between the layout, and some people had said, well, perhaps it was the Pleiades as well, and that there's links to the Pleiades.
If these hills match the Orion's belt, is what you're talking about, and the constellation of Orion, surely they would have to be man-made hills.
Well, no. Well, I don't know. I mean, I suppose coincidence would say at some point in some part of the world you're going to get two big hills and a small one. I'd not say that man-made, but you would get these perhaps areas where I'm a big fan of Graham Hancock in his books, and when he talks about Earth mirrors and heavens mirrors, and maybe this Burton Dassett just happens to be one of those areas that has the same geography that matches the Orion Belt, which, when you know about that, draws, whatever these objects might be, and whether they're advanced civilizations or on and off Earth, it draws them towards them because of the sort of geology and geography of the area. So
we talked about Hessdalen earlier. For those who are not aware, Hessdalen is in central Norway. It's a community there. It's only got a few hundred people live there. It's quite isolated. And in the early 1980s, strange lights were started to be seen in the Hessdalen Valley. So the UFO groups of Norway and Sweden set up camp there and managed to record them and photograph them and so on. Brings us right up to date. There is a scientific research station there 24 hours a day now. But it's interesting, a lot of the researchers think that these may be lights caused by the Earth, fault lines, pressure, and so on. But one of my best friends is a Norwegian. It's called Odd Gunnar Road. He was part of Project Hessdalen, and he doesn't agree. He said the amount of times that the lights would appear, and then they get their camera gear out, because they couldn't leave it out because it was in the winter, because everything just froze solid. They get the camera gear out and so on, and the lights would go out. So they put the camera away and they come back on again. He says this happened far too many times, as far as he was concerned, for it to be coincidental. And there are some photographs in the project's files of the cameras that they did leave out, and all you can see is these huge, great icicles hanging from the front of them. It was that cold. Give you an idea, I went to Hessdalen in, I think it was about 1980. I can't remember if it's 86 or 87. And my friend lives a good, 14, 16 hours drive from them. So the first place we went to was his local petrol station to fill up. So he filled up the car, and then he opened all the car doors and the bonnet and the boot. And he got this little tin with a sponge on the end. And he went all around the outside of the doors and everything, and then shut it up. And I'm thinking, what's he doing? It's, this is winter, it's freezing. And I said, what are you doing? He said, so the doors don't freeze. I'm thinking, where are we going?
Yeah.
Because in 84 or 85, he took Alan Hynek to Hessdalen.
Yeah.
And on the way there, it got so cold that the car literally did freeze and come to a dead stop. So,
yeah,
gives you some idea.
Well, I can say so. Around that time, 1988, I with the military, I did some Arctic warfare training in Lillehammer, or near Lillehammer, which is where they held the Winter Olympics. Yeah. And certainly staying out a night there is nothing else comes close really, and moving around using Nordic skiing is exhausting, but that does keep you warm. But it is a really beautiful and really interesting part of the world. So I'm not sure where Hessdalen is
It's right in central Norway. I wouldn't know the geography for Lillehammer, but it's right in the centre. And there's only a couple of hundred people there. And what was the interesting part, of course, a lot of these things were seen down. There's three mountains. I can't pronounce the names of them. They were seen down below the mountains and in the valley itself. And of course, the locals knew there was no road up there. There was no snow scooters in the winter up there. And they caught them on film many times. They've even now got it on video, of course, or I should say on a digital recording of the lights going down the valley. They've had science trips there. I think it's even taught in the local high school there now. And the man who still is, the chap that runs it is a chap called Erling Strand. He was right there from the beginning. And it's a fascinating area. So people think that, investigating strange lights is not as interesting as, alien abductions and things like this. I would disagree, because here we have an event, The Lights Upon the Hills, the Burton Dassett UFO events of 1923. That's the title of your book. And as we've seen, it could go back literally, as Chris said, centuries or millennia.
Yes, I think so. And I think the thing that really interests me is this this idea of things that are tangible. So I think these were tangible objects that were moving around. I'm very much in the sort of nuts and bolts camp. I think that's how we will influence change within a wider society.
I was going to put the opposite argument. If it's been seen in the same location for, let's say, hundreds of years, would that not highlight perhaps there's a natural phenomena that's been observed there, but we currently don't understand it?
Yeah, I mean, possibly. I mean, I think for me, I think so there's another story of a motorcyclist travelling around late at night. Again, motorcycles are in infancy. He turns a corner and one of these lights is coming towards him, and he goes one way and the light goes the other. And I think that they do demonstrate some sort of intelligence control. The idea of lighting up a house, this sort of grid system they seem to be moving at. To me, Phil, I do think they're under some form of intelligence control. Why and where they're from is, of course, mystery that you'd hope to solve one day. I do give one version, and there seem to be maybe there'd be more reports if there were natural phenomena. So, something seems to have gone on around the early medieval period, and then we haven't really got anything else, and then we get something around about 1923. So if it was more like the Earth lights that are associated with the Rollright stones, which isn't too far away, where lights are seen in a really small area going between the Rollright stones. The Rollright stones, just for your listeners that don't know, are very small. It's like a henge originally, but with small stones in, and it is probably goes back to the Stone Age or Neolithic age.
Yeah.
And their lights are seen going around these stones. There was reports of lights going around these stones. That, to me, seems more of a natural phenomenon. But the Burton Dassett lights in 1923, when you look at the different reports, there seems to be some sort of aim or some sort of focus around what they're doing. So yeah, I mean, it's I'm not saying I'm right at all. People have their own theories, and I think that's partly why I wrote the book, just to say, well, people can read and they can make their own mind up.
Do you know what? I think that's a brilliant place to actually end the conversation there, because I think it's great that you've actually gone out there, Richard, and looked into this. And yes, it needs bringing out. All these kind of reports need bringing out so that the UFO community today can become aware and be informed of past experiences. Where do we get the book?
So the books are obviously available from Philip's excellent flying disc press. But it's also available on Amazon. If you just search The Lights Upon the Hills, and there's a Kindle version, or there's the really nice hardback book with pictures and a really nice front cover that was done for us, which I'm still really chuffed with.
So
yeah, download it on Amazon. Go out and do yourself a treat, because it's only a $5. So, I mean, I was going to say it's not even the price of a pint, but you can't buy one at the moment.
No, still waiting for that.
So it is a treat, and I would echo what Chris had to say. And it's one of the reasons why I didn't hesitate to think, well, we have to publish this. And congratulations on it, Richard. It's a splendid piece of work. It really is.
That's very kind, Philip, coming from yourself. That's really, it means a lot. And yeah, thank you for all your help around getting behind it. It's been a fantastic experience, speaking to the likes of yourself and Chris. And I've spoken to people in America and all around the world, and they've been really positive about the book. So it's been a really good experience.
Excellent. So Richard Rokeby, thank you very much for joining us today on the Inside Outer Limits radio show. And it's goodbye from me, Chris Evers, the man from Outer Limits magazine, and
regular feature.
Yeah, and it's a good evening from Philip in Pontefract.
Ah, dear. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Good night.